Good evening, and welcome to Historically Speaking. My name, if we haven't been introduced, is Peter Laporte. I have the pleasure of being the Executive Director of the St. Mary's County Historical Society. In a couple of minutes, Dr. Uguez will introduce our speaker. And I have to say, noting the weather, it is now raining, that Dr. Masur, we expect you to have lightning flashes of brilliance, followed by our thunderous applause. That's my one attempt at humor this evening. But before we start, I want to say just a couple of words about the Historical Society and the Historically Speaking series. The Historical Society was founded in 1951 as a member-focused organization. Its mission is to preserve, protect, interpret the history of this county and indeed southern Maryland. We're headquartered over in Tudor Hall in Leonardtown, a beautiful 18th century manor house. If you haven't been there, please do stop by. And among other things, we publish an outstanding quarterly journal called the Chronicles of St. Mary's. It provides in-depth articles, well-researched as well, of the people, places, and events that have shaped this county. We've got about 650 members, about 25-30% of whom are not even in Maryland. And we invite you, if you're not already, to consider please joining us as a member. The Historically Speaking series was begun, I'm going to lose the computer, don't go down. The Historically Speaking series was begun in 2020, and its purpose really is to bring attention to the political, legal, economic, social, and religious history of southern Maryland. And indeed, the legacy of southern Maryland, St. Mary's County in particular, both within Maryland and beyond. We invite scholars, researchers, and informed contributors of all types to share their work through lectures and conversations, all of which are videotaped, including tonight's presentation, and made available to the public and our members through the Historical Society's website. This evening's program marks the 7th in that series. Past programs have included some little-known and extraordinary histories of the Pax River Naval Air Station, the people that were stationed there, both in World War II and during the Cold War. Those are on video. In September of 2020, and deep into COVID, we held a virtual lecture here at the college by Judge Daniel Friedman, who is on the Maryland Court of Special Appeal, and that was entitled, Who Came First? State Declarations of Rights in the Revolutionary Era. And that dealt with Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware's implementation of individual rights. That was done on our first production done with the Center for the Study of Democracy. In April of last year, 2021, Army historian Dr. Jamie Goodall presented Pirates of the Chesapeake Bay from colonial period to the Oyster Wars. In June, the Historical Society, along with the Center, collaborated on our second lecture together, titled Maryland, Voices of the Civil War, with historian Charles W. Mitchell from the Maryland Historical Society. And capping off the series last August, in partnership with Historic St. Mary's City and the Chesterton Academy of St. Mary's, we had an absorbing talk by Dr. Michael Riedenbach of Ave Maria University on his then just published book by Harvard Press entitled Our Dear-Bought Liberty, Catholics and Religious Toleration in Early America. All those books, by the way, are available from us at the Historical Society. Tonight's program represents a milestone in our collaboration with the Center for the Study of Democracy. Its director, Dr. Uguez, and we share an interest, I'd call it a passion, for the people and the history of southern Maryland, particularly as they have influenced and contributed beyond its borders, to a wider narrative beyond this humble county. Accordingly, Dr. Uguez and the Historical Society have agreed to jointly develop historically speaking programs well into the future, exploring a diverse and, we hope, interesting landscape. Our program's next program will be will concern archaeological findings that tell the role of children in the colonial Chesapeake area, with Catherine Dye, who is an archaeology graduate from this college. And indeed, it is an interesting program. I've read her paper on this and invited her, because children are very rarely regarded in their total experiences and their fullness during the colonial period. So, please stay tuned. Watch our website at www.stmaryshistory.org for information, or better still, consider becoming a member if you're not. We are proud of this partnership with the Center for the Study of Democracy. And with that said, it gives me a great pleasure to introduce my friend and our moderator for this evening, Professor Antonio Uguez.
Thank you, Peter. The Center for the Study of Democracy appreciates the partnership of the St. Mary's County Historical Society in presenting tonight's joint program. And we, as you mentioned, are eager to continue in our collaboration as we work together to explore the history of St. Mary's County and Southern Maryland more broadly. Good evening. My name is Tony Uguez. I'm the director of the Center for the Study of Democracy here at St. Mary's College of Maryland. I would like to open our event by offering an example of how St. Mary's College continues to work toward acknowledging the truth in our history, which is consistent with the mission of the Center for the Study of Democracy. In August, the college initiated a land acknowledgement and pledge to be read at the start of each event and to be displayed throughout our campus. It reads, "We acknowledge that the land on which we are learning, working, and gathering today is the ancestral home of the Yakakomiko and Piscataway peoples. We also acknowledge that St. Mary's City was partly built and enslaved by people of African descent. Through this acknowledgement, we recognize these communities and all those who have been displaced and enslaved through colonization. Given the unique importance on the land on which we sit, and given the unique educational mission of St. Mary's College of Maryland as the National Public Honors College, we pledge to continue to unearth and understand these historic realities so that they inform all of our work. We also pledge to work tirelessly in making our institution more accessible, inclusive, and equitable, especially for those populations most affected by societal inequities. And we do this with the understanding that by supporting and learning from all of our diverse communities, we build a more sustainable future for all. It is an honor to welcome you this evening. After the past year or so of virtual events, it's a pleasure to be with you in person here on this night, albeit a stormy night. But I'm very happy to be here, very happy to continue our collaboration with the St. Mary's County Historical Society. A little bit about the Center. The Center for the Study of Democracy is a marquee program, a joint partnership of St. Mary's College of Maryland and historic St. Mary's City. Its mission is to explore contemporary and historical issues associated with democracy, liberty, and justice in national and international contexts. The Center facilitates activities that strengthen democracy, which is much needed today, and the rule of law, enhance security and individual freedoms, invigorate civil society, encourage free enterprise, and increase economic, environmental, educational, and cultural equity. The Center believes that we can create an inclusive, diverse, and equitable community here at St. Mary's that can be a model for others, and we continue to act on that belief by bringing to campus such thought-provoking speakers such as tonight's guest. It's now my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Laura Masur. Dr. Masur is an assistant professor of anthropology at the Catholic University of America. She received her MA in anthropology from the College of William and Mary in 2013 and her PhD from Boston University's Archaeology program and Department of Anthropology in 2019. Dr. Masur conducts research on archaeological and museum collections from across North America and has worked in colonial Williamsburg, Alexandria Archaeology, the Fairfield Foundation, the Smithsonian Institution, and our very own historic St. Mary's City. Dr. Masur's research focuses on the archaeology of Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania from 1600 to the present. This evening's talk will explore the interconnectedness of different people via Maryland's Jesuit plantations. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Laura Masur.
I'm going to hold this here so you can all see me. Otherwise, I'm going to be sort of hidden behind the computer here. So thank you so much, Dr. Uguez, for that lovely introduction. Maybe I should move over here. It's really my pleasure to be here tonight. It's always my pleasure to be in Southern Maryland. I was, especially with the rainy weather, I'm remembering all the times I would go and visit my aunt and uncle at Calvert Cliffs as a child, especially around Memorial Day, where we go and my parents would say, "Oh, don't go and run in the water. You know, you'll have plenty of time later when you can put your swimsuit on." And of course, we'd go and run in the water in our clothes and get soaked and, get in trouble for that. But I have so many fond memories of being down here as a child, and it's been really wonderful to be able to come down and do research here. So what I'll be speaking about tonight is really, one avenue of the research that got started close to 10 years ago. I was a graduate student and thinking about a dissertation project, and I wanted to study Catholic communities. And I'm an archaeologist, so I wanted to look at the archaeology of Catholic communities. And by a sort of circuitous route, I came down to Southern Maryland, and I saw a plantation called St. Inigo's where there'd been a lot of archaeology done. So I said, "Oh, this looks like a good place to work." And so when I got started, I started looking at all of the archaeological reports from projects that had been done in the past. I looked at historical records. I spent a lot of time reading through Edwin Beitzel's lovely volume, and it's a lot to go through. He did a lot of research. And so I started with that, and so I want to get started looking at, one of those documents that I came across in his work. And this is a register. He says, "A list of Negroes belonging to St. Inigo's congregation." And so these are people who are not white. These are people of color who are Catholic, who are members of the congregation, the Catholic congregation at St. Ignatius Parish, right down the road, 5-6 minutes from here. And so some of these individuals I've seen quite a bit in looking at the 18th century records. People like Betty and Matthew and Susan had lived at St. Inigo's for most of their lives. At this point, this is a record from about 1769, and they had lived at St. Inigo's for at least 35 years at this time. And that's about as far back as the really detailed records go. But others, we don't have a whole lot of information. I'm intrigued by Portuguese Joseph here. I think he probably spoke Portuguese. Perhaps he worked on a Portuguese naval vessel. It looks like he was enslaved, but we don't really know anything else about him. But George Mingo here, I looked at his name and I said, well, that's interesting. Mingo is not a name that I hear every day, right? A lot of these seem like they're very much, these are Catholics, these are people who are part of this Catholic congregation, and so they have these very typical Christian names. But George Mingo, I said, this sounds kind of familiar. So I started thinking about what does Mingo mean? Where does this name come from? So some of you may have encountered this concept, this term, if you read Last of the Mohicans. So this is an 1826 novel by James Fenimore Cooper. You may have seen the 1992 film as well. I remember watching that. One of my friends in college was like, you have to watch all of these movies, and this was one of the ones he decided we had to watch. And so in this story, it takes place during the French and Indian War, during the 1750s. There are two sisters, they're daughters of a British colonel. They're kidnapped by the Hurons, an indigenous nation, and it sort of follows the sort of mythic history of that capture. And it's very much, it's myth, right? It's myth rather than history. There are still plenty of Mohicans who are alive and well today and have their own nation. But the reason I bring this up is because Mingos are mentioned in this story. They're not mentioned in a positive way, right? This is considered generally a racial slur today. They're people who are seen as being kind of duplicitous and not to be trusted. And if we look at the way that this term is used historically, it's used to refer to Iroquoian speakers. If you think about the Iroquois, these are indigenous people who live in present-day New York. These are people who specifically are members of the present-day Haudenosaunee, and they are specifically people who live along the Ohio River Valley. They are in present-day Pennsylvania, Ohio. And so after going through all of this, I said, well, this is odd. Why is George Mingo in southern Maryland? How does he end up here? And how does he end up in this, this really sort of insular place? And it tells us, maybe we're looking at a much more interconnected and cosmopolitan world than we thought. And so I want to use this as a way of a starting point for thinking about St. Inigo's plantation in a broader way. Rather than just, a place of enslavement, this is a really diverse community. And also we're thinking about this as a diverse place for the Jesuits' mission. So we can see here, one of the things I was grappling with when I was thinking about George Mingo at first is, what is he doing here? Is he enslaved? Is he African American? Is he indigenous? Is it a mixture? And the answer is we probably don't know, and we never will know. But what we do know is the kinds of objects he's purchasing over the course of about 3 years. Things like shoes and cloth, but also a set of rosary beads, which is particularly intriguing. Silk and brandy, and we know that he's paid wages and paid very regularly, such that I think he's probably a free individual who makes his way to St. Inigo's, and then at some point, after about 3 years, he leaves, and we never see him again in the historical record. And this is something that's not uncommon with individuals who don't necessarily own their own land. You see them for snippets, and then they're gone. So when to cycle back a little bit, to get some context about St. Inigo's, what this plantation's like, and sort of the context of what's going on with the Jesuits. The Jesuits, for anybody who shockingly isn't familiar with them, especially those of you who are down here, are a congregation of Roman Catholic priests and brothers. And they accompany the earliest colonization of Maryland. They're essentially investors in the colony. So Cecil Calvert invites them to come and says, I want you to come, I want you to minister to all of the English Catholics. What Calvert has in mind is this grand experiment. We are going to show everyone in England that Catholics and Protestants can get along. It doesn't go very well. And so it's interesting when you see that goal, right? Because whenever I was just in the UK for a couple weeks, and you go to the Tower of London and you see, and this is where so and so got their head chopped off, and the Catholics are prime among many of those people, right? And so when you look at this, all of these conflicts that are happening in England, they come back, right? They come and they cross over the ocean, and they're happening in Maryland as well. So what we'll see is, during the English Civil War in the 1640s, you see those conflicts come over, and we have the Ingalls Rebellion, or the Plundering Time, in 1644 to 46. When you see the Glorious Revolution, and no secret how the British remember this, right? It's a glorious revolution where Protestant monarchs succeed the throne of Catholics. And so this is a point in which the proprietary colony held by the Calverts turns into a royal colony. And by 1704, 1804, it's no longer legal to publicly practice Catholicism. And so all of the churches, like the one that's just across the street, at beautifully reconstructed at St. Mary's City, all of these are closed. They're disassembled, and the center of Catholicism really moves to private lands. And the Jesuits in this whole scheme of things during the 17th century, they're interested in coming, they're interested in converting Protestants, but they're also interested in converting indigenous people. And this is perhaps one of the most interesting aspects of the Jesuits in 17th century history. Father Andrew White is a principal player in this history. He's a really well-known missionary. He is able to go and live with Piscataways and other native groups. He converts the Piscataway Tayak, and this is seen as a really, pivotal moment in the success of the mission. And a lot of the histories have debated, is this conversion something that's really valid or done for spiritual reasons? And I think there's always political reasons for conversion. I mean, you look at English history, there's always politics involved. But the theme that comes out of a lot of these histories of Indian missions is that as a result of all these tumultuous events in the 1640s, the missions end. The Jesuits say, they just sort of give up, and they're like, this is too hard. We can't have these Indian missions anymore. And one of the things I'll get to is that's not true. They definitely do continue, and I'll save that for a little bit later. And this is something that's really persists in a lot of Catholic history. So John Gilmarie Shea, who's a really prominent Catholic historian, says that, after the execution of, I think, Charles I in 1649, the Indian mission of Maryland was closed forever, and the Jesuits were restricted to the care of the whites. And this is something that became really part of the prevailing narrative of Maryland and the Jesuits in Maryland, that the mission changes after this period. And to a certain extent, that's right, but it's a little bit more complicated than that. And so what I want to focus on today is thinking about, what those complications look like, what it means when the center of Catholicism moves to private land. And so when we're looking at the Jesuits' actions during this period, here we are, right down here, right by St. Inigo's plantation. They say, we envision something a little bit different from the Calverts. We envision a society that is holistically and completely Catholic. We want everybody to be Catholics. We want to convert everybody. And of course, there's some problems with this, right? When you have these conflicting visions of what a colony will be. And so what they try and do is they say, well, we're going to try and convert people. We're going to try and get land so we can start schools, so we can start a college that isn't ultimately established until after the American Revolution, Georgetown University. But they buy land. So what you can see here, the numbers are the gradual acquisition of land, moving up from southern Maryland, gradually up here. And I've been working on archaeological projects down here, but also right up here on the eastern shore at Bohemia. So they're gradually moving out of southern Maryland and into the broader middle Atlantic. And what they do is initially they bring over indentured servants to work the land. They, are growing tobacco, and there's some scandals that happen during this period because they don't really trust the Protestants who are working on their plantations. But what they gradually do is they transition, like most people do who can afford it, to enslaving African Americans. And this is a really, poorly documented transition, and also one that needs to be talked about more. And certainly something that has found its way into the news because of stories that the New York Times put out with Georgetown. A lot of really, really incredible genealogical research and archival research that's been done to connect, almost, I think, 10,000 descendants with the history of their ancestors who lived in Maryland, who lived in Washington, D.C. and Pennsylvania, and were ultimately sold to Louisiana. The Jesuits got into a lot of trouble because by the early 19th century, they were not making a lot of money off of their plantations. And so ultimately they decide to sell the large part of their enslaved community to Louisiana. Many others are either evade the sale, they're sold locally, or remain enslaved by the Jesuits until emancipation. And so if you've encountered this story, this is probably where you've encountered it, through Georgetown. And I've been working with a lot of these descendants in the ongoing archaeological projects. And it's been a really rich experience. And they, they always remind me, what is important about this project, and to recenter it on, the majority of people who are really living at these plantations. So I want to pause and take a step back, because we've been talking a lot about plantations, right? This is where the Jesuits are living. This is where the center of their land is. But we've also been talking, sort of skirting around this idea of mission, this idea of Indian missions. Did they end? Well, what happens with missions after that? And we sort of have these boxes, right? We have this idea of having missions, and that is something that is distinct. This is something that's an indigenous space. And then we have plantations, and this is all about economic production, whereas missions are about religious conversion. And we have these really iconic images we might think about associated with missions, places like Mission Santa Barbara, and we have the iconic mission bells where, you just have to go to a grocery store and buy some tortillas to go ahead and see this image. And there's some really very evocative aesthetics that go along with this, evocative ideas. Just like there are with images of plantations, the tree-lined lane, and outbuildings, slave quarters. And these are places today that are sort of sites of conflict. Dr. Uguez mentioned we need a lot of democracy today, right? These are sites of conflict because there are different visions about what these places are. Are these places positive places, places where we remember a history of, a history of religion, a history of Southern culture? Or are these places that we think of as places of violence? Places of enslavement, places of the loss of indigenous cultural traditions. And these are sites of protest today as a result. And so this is, but nonetheless, they're always separate places, right? They're always separate. They're always something different. But when we look at Maryland, we see these ideas coming together, right? These images, these aesthetics coming together, whether it's churches, like the one right across the street, whether it's mission bells. This one is from Conewago, one of the Jesuits' plantations in Pennsylvania. I talked with someone who grew up right by the church, and he said he always remembered the bell tolling multiple times a day for Angelus prayers, where it would toll 3 times a day to remind everyone to say their prayers. And it's something where you can't escape this. As well as the vistas from manor houses. If any of you have been to Chapel Point, there's a beautiful view from this house and the church that's attached to it. And one of the few surviving or only surviving slave quarters from this mission, from these plantations. And that's the thing, it's hard to separate the two when you're looking at Maryland, right? And it's not just Maryland, right? One of the things when we look at cross-cultural example, the English colonization, and we move towards New France. I don't know if anybody has ever had a chance to visit Ste. Marie among the Hurons. This is a reconstructed mission village just north of Toronto, reconstructed based on really extensive archaeological investigations. So if we're looking outside of Maryland to see what these examples, examples of missions look like, I challenge you, does anybody see a church here? Anything that looks especially like a church? I was looking at it the other day and I was like, I can't find it, right? Yeah, and you would think, yeah, like it's in the center, but the architecture it's not what we always think of when we think of this sort of Spanish kind of mission vista. It's something different, and this is a village that's a central mission, but a lot of the French missionaries, the French Jesuit missionaries, they're going out to native villages, or they're operating through French forts. They're operating with knowledge that the center of the French economy, the French colonial economy, is in fur-bearing animals, right? Because it's cold and they make really great fur. Whereas the seigneurial land system, this is the essentially feudal system of land ownership, there's money to be made, but you make a whole lot more money when you're getting nice furs to sell back to Europe. And so when we're looking at this, these missions are deeply ingrained with the local economy. They're also deeply ingrained with military systems as well. And so when we look at these missions, we have these stereotypical ideas. If anybody's seen the film Black Robe, that the Jesuits are going out and living in native villages. They're engaging with them in spiritual learning and growth, but also in this sort of immersed in this economic system. But they're also some of the largest seigneurial landowners, and we know almost nothing about this. No one's really focused on this, and I can't wait for some historians of New France to look at the land that the Jesuits own and try and make sense of what they're doing there. Are there people who are indigenous who come to work for the Jesuits? Are indigenous people enslaved here? Are there enslaved Africans? We don't know what's going on here. And sometimes our absence, what comes into our narrative is based off of what historians have found and what they've expected to find, rather than just all the information that there is. When we look at missions in places like Alta California, places like Mission Santa Barbara, we again see this typical, you have the church and the upper court, but you also have all of these different economic aspects of the mission. There's mills, potteries, granaries, a weaving mill. You can see some of these buildings here, and they're really scattered throughout the mission. They have to feed themselves, right? They need to grow grain. They have to have animals in their corrals. They have to have an orchard and a garden here. So you can see this is deeply ingrained with, a system of pastoralism. They're raising cattle, raising livestock. They're growing crops. They have to have a threshing floor to do that. They're producing material objects. And so it's this mission itself is not just a place of conversion. It's an economic place as well. And you can also see soldiers' quarters here if you look carefully. So again, this connection to the military. And so when we come back to Maryland and we take a look at St. Inigo's, you can see, again, there's a church. So I'm sure many of you have visited St. Ignatius Church. I'm not sure if anyone hasn't, right? Residences, quarters that are probably, disturbed by the runways that are there today. But also windmills for grains, weaver's house for economic production. And so you can see that when we're trying to put these places into categories, these sites into categories, it doesn't quite fit because there's so much overlap. And so this is, something that really caused me to think a little bit differently. When we're talking about a mission, when we're talking about a plantation, we don't have to be talking about completely separate places. And so one of the things that I've started thinking about is the fact that, when you are establishing a mission, you have to pay for it too. You have to have a way of supporting this economically. And so what I've been starting to think about is that missions aren't just places. A mission is something that can happen in any location. A mission is something that can happen in a courthouse. It's something that can happen in an indigenous village. It's something that can happen on a plantation. And so if we sort of step outside of these categories, we can get a much deeper view of what's happening in Maryland and beyond. And so I want to talk about 3 examples, specifically looking at indigenous examples and looking at some of the tenant farmers, and then also looking at the enslaved and free black communities that are surrounding these plantations, to look at sort of the depth and the complexity of these communities that surround the Jesuits' missions. And so I said I would come back to this sort of history of Indian missions. And one of the things that I've noticed after going through so many of these records is there's always these snippets of, the Jesuits having interactions with Native people long after this period in the 1640s when their missions are supposed to have ended. They keep reaching out to indigenous communities, and maybe they're successful, maybe they're not. But they still try. So one of the things you can see if you look at this map, so each of these is the location of one of those plantations or a church. This is a church in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, Philadelphia here, down here in St. Mary's City. But if you look at all of these locations, and then you also look at these here, these are native villages where there are Roman Catholic artifacts that have been discovered archaeologically. And so one of the things this is actually why I got started in this, I was like, okay, as part of research, I'm gonna go take a look at some of these collections in the State Museum of Pennsylvania. And I just kept finding more stuff, and I pulled one thing out and I said, oh, it's a rosary. And it hadn't been cataloged this way, it hadn't been thought about this way, because it's made of, common trade beads. And then I started working with a scholar of Latin. He was actually a Latin teacher and then went on to spend some time in Rome. And he's been going ahead and translating some of the letters into English. And they talk about, in between 1648 and 89, the Virginia mission. The Virginia mission, I thought Virginia was an even more hostile place than Maryland, but they have a mission there. They're trying to make inroads. They're trying to convert everybody. There's a New York mission. Governor Thomas Dongan of New York, in a very brief period, is Catholic, and he wants the Jesuits to come make inroads with the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois. And so he basically says, well, I'll install some English Jesuits here, and we can sort of, further English interests in New York against the French. It doesn't last very long, especially, after when you think about that glorious revolution in 1689. Some of these, I think it's Harrison, just sort of disappears, and the Jesuits assume that he died. And then by the time you get to this period right before the French and Indian War, you see more evidence of Jesuits going into Pennsylvania, trying to reach out to the Susquehannocks or Conestogas, and the Piscataways or Conoys who have migrated up into the Lancaster area right around here. And all of these priests, these are the names of specific priests who are associated with these missions. This isn't their full-time job, right? They're based out of these churches, these plantations, and they're traveling around to minister to different communities, but they're also reaching out to Native people. And what really sells me on this is all of these artifacts that are showing up from sites. So Conestoga Town and Conoy Town are two of the ones that are located right along here. And crosses, crucifixes, medals, rosaries showing up primarily in funerary contexts. And this is, only one side, right, of the perspective. Yes, the Jesuits are trying to reach out to them. What Native people make of this missionary outreach is something a little bit more complicated. And that's something that I've explored elsewhere. But it's, when we're looking at this, this is not just a story that ends in the 17th, 18th century. This is something that continues. So if you look at the Jesuits' sort of chronicles of their missions, by the time you get to the early 20th century, they're sort of waxing poetic and thinking nostalgically about histories of places like St. Thomas Manor, St. Ignatius Church at Chapel Point, that one with a really good view. And they talk about a group of people. Again, this is a term that's generally considered a racial slur, resorts. And they talk about them. These are people of mixed origin, mixed ancestry, but particularly with indigenous ancestry. And they talk about them as being a really integral part of the community, of the Catholic community at St. Ignatius. And so one of the things when I talk to descendants of people who were enslaved, they also bring up like, oh yeah, I'm also Piscataway, or I'm a wee sort, right? They're telling me this, and it's something really fascinating. It's something really interesting to see this kind of integrated history. It's not something that's written down. It's not something that people focus on historically. Other than an ethno-historian, Paul Cisna, who writes, at some point, a lot of Piscataways convert because many of them are Catholic today. So one of the things I've been thinking about when we're interpreting archaeological evidence, when we have evidence of fur trade, things like tenterhooks or trade beads or these beautiful locally made terracotta pipes, this we can read as evidence of trade, right? But, the Jesuits aren't ever okay with just trading. They're not okay with anything ever being just economic. And so they're always thinking about how can we integrate conversion with these economic activities. And that's sort of a direction that I'm thinking about, like how can we make those interpretations when I'm out in the field and digging up these kinds of materials. So I also mentioned when you see the Act to Prevent the Growth of Popery in 1704, you have a transition to Catholicism that's based out of manor houses, based out of private land, both the Jesuits themselves, but also other wealthy Catholics. And this kind of manor house Catholicism has been written on extensively by historians like Tricia Pine and Beatrix Hardy. They use probate records to reconstruct some of the goods that people are keeping at their houses, priests' robes, altar cloths, basically vessels for making and serving the Eucharist. And the Jesuits are moving around to all of these different locations. And sometimes in their saddlebags they put an altar stone, but some people would keep these at their house. And this is something that's required to say a mass. There's a relic of a saint in it, a first-class relic, so human remains that's embedded in the stone. This one's broken, but you can see the cross on it here. It'd be larger, about this big. And so this one actually comes out of an archaeological site in Anne Arundel County, Romany Road on Gibson Island. And I'll note here, I didn't dig up any of these devotional artifacts. I am the benefit of many decades of really excellent research. And everyone's just generous to let me take a look at them and pull them all together. And so we see that this sort of manor house Catholicism is something that continues. This is probably put in an archaeological fill around, after 1820 or so. So this is something that continues long after, the passage of the Bill of Rights. People are still maintaining this tradition of having their own private chapels. And you see that, this kind of preaching happens not just on plantations, not just in manor houses, despite, all of the political issues. This is happening in places like Port Tobacco Courthouse. And it's always the suspicious Protestants who are saying, like, we don't like this. Why are the Jesuits doing this? They're distributing pamphlets. It's not okay. I don't like this happening in St. Mary's County. And much the same, we know that the Jesuits have indigenous people who are coming to live on some of their plantations. Places like Berks County, Pennsylvania, a suspicious Protestant, Conrad Weiser, is saying that they have Indians living on their manor. It's not okay. And they come and they're like, oh, well, they're beggars. It's okay. But this kind of mission that's happening around these plantations, it really extends to the people who are coming to work as tenant farmers. So in addition to having indentured laborers, in addition to enslaving people who are growing tobacco and other crops, there are also people who are tenant farmers working there, who essentially have their own small farms. And we see that the Jesuits are either trying to recruit Catholics to be their tenant farmers, or they are saying, we're going to convert you. So you see one exercise to Thomas Drury, and one of the same to William Spalding. These are both tenant farmers, so they're administering the spiritual exercises, this form of spiritual reflection and growth to their tenant farmers. And this becomes so much so notable that a Reverend Smith, who's not a Jesuit, but comes to visit the colonies right after the American Revolution, is really scandalized by the fact that all of these communities are living on the Jesuits' plantation and around them. And he said it would be much better for them to go move west to Kentucky, where they can own their own farms. And he can't make sense of why the Jesuits are encouraging people to live here. And it's something that I think is very deeply rooted in community, but also economic need. You can't separate the two when you're looking at these sites. And this is something that really continues on. Some of you may recognize a miraculous medal here, and this is from one of the Jesuits' tenant farms in this is from Cedar Point Neck in Charles County. So this is probably from a period of the late 19th or early 20th centuries. So this is, again, from a tenant house. This is someone who is, maybe they are Catholic, maybe they're not, but the Jesuits are trying to make sure that they are. And something that continues on to the point where they start leaving the plantations to go elsewhere. There's a gradual transition to moving away from the area towards cities. So for those of you familiar, this is the interior of St. Ignatius Church. And this is a coastal survey showing this little house, probably that Miller's house that was on the former map of St. Inigo's. And an individual lives here. He's a tenant farmer for about 40 or 50 years, Dominic Rayleigh. And he, works for a long time as a tenant farmer, and he can't do it anymore. And the Jesuits say, okay, you can go be the caretaker and look over the manor house and make sure everything stays good. And you can actually see his name in this really remarkable 1930s photo, Dominic Rayleigh, on the pew in the church. And so you can see these two things are connected, and oftentimes you get special privileges if you're a part of this community. So finally, I want to talk about the enslaved community and their role in this mission. We know, again, it's not well documented when the Jesuits invest in slavery, but we know by the early decades of the 18th century, many people are enslaved on these plantations at Newtown and St. Inigo's. So you can see, Matthew, Betty, and Susan, who we saw on that record from 1769. Here they are in 1734. As part of this community. And one of the things that we know is that many of these individuals, when they, for one reason or another, they decide to convert. We bring you back to the fact that we are looking at people who are part of St. Inigo's congregation. Many of these people, there are 14 people listed here, and about 20 people are enslaved at St. Inigo's at this time. So this is a significant proportion of the population. And one of the things that's particularly notable, we see this a lot in sacramental records because the Jesuits are always noting race. The records are kept in Latin, so you can see those notations. You see this in Maryland, you see this into Pennsylvania as well. And so by the time you get to this period of the 1830s, there's a lot of records of really strong devotions to Catholicism among the enslaved. So by the time you get to 1838, and this is the year of that sale, Joseph Carberry, he's the priest stationed at St. Inigo's, says almost all of the blacks have embraced the Catholic faith. And this is one of the things that makes this sale so disturbing and challenging to think about, because it's not just selling people, it's not just dividing families, it's tearing a community that had been purposefully, converted and told to be Catholic, right? To live this life, live out their faith. But this, isn't an end, right? Many people who either evade the sale, who are enslaved on other plantations, who are free, they continue to form Catholic communities and form their own communities. So St. Peter Claver, again, just down the road, is sort of the product of those really strong communities. You can see here the missions expand, and especially the Jesuits established churches specifically geared towards African American tenant farmers, especially places like Prince George's County. So both of these artifacts are from sites in Prince George's County. And this one, probably can't see the details here. It's the Virgin Mary on one side and St. Francis Xavier on the other side, so a Jesuit saint. But the writing on it is actually in Chinese. And I actually found out about this one. I found out about this one because I was playing pool with somebody in a bar, and they were like, "Hey, have you heard about these artifacts?" I was like, "No, I'll have to go look this up." Kristen Monteperto, who's done a lot of really great work, did a long-term project at this site, Northampton Quarter, and she was able to uncover the fact that two individuals lived here, Lizzie and Robert Hawkins. And these individuals, they lived there from at least 1870. And they baptized their daughter in Holy Family Catholic Church, which is a church that was established by the Jesuits as ministry to African-American tenant farmers. So we can see, at least in this one instance, and this is just one artifact, there's a fragment of a rosary and quite a few other artifacts from this site. You can see it at other ones like Willow Grove in Prince George's County, just down the road from one of the Jesuits' plantations at White Marsh, one of their churches that continues to operate. And so you can see these missions continue, and one of the things, if you read through the Jesuit records in the Woodstock letters, they write a lot about these missions, and not always in ways that reflect well on them, in ways that show their own consciousness about race in a way that we would read today as being extraordinarily racist. They write it down, so at least we know today. And so to conclude, I want to think about that, that the example of George Mingo, the fact that we can't really piece together exactly who he is or exactly what racial group we can put him in, and it's equally likely that he belongs to these different communities because they're all present on the plantations and surrounding the plantations. And we can see the legacy of this. Places like St. Mary's Catholic Church of Piscataway, so the mural that I showed you on the first slide with Indian missions, it's in this church. This is a church that really celebrates the Piscataway connection to Catholicism. And places like St. Peter Claver Catholic Church, which is established in the early 20th century because of a really nasty event that happens at a Christmas Mass that and this is all, sort of passed down in oral traditions that, the congregation, the white and black congregants just couldn't get along, and especially because of, growing segregation and Jim Crow laws. And so this church is established and really becomes, a home for the Black Catholic community. And it's part of this legacy of this original mission at St. Inigo's. Just like the St. Mary's Catholic Church of Piscataway is a legacy of this original Indian mission, one that certainly doesn't end in the 1640s. So when we reflect on some of these histories written during the 19th century, the fact that, the Jesuits just have to care for the whites, that the Indian mission is closed, this isn't true. And we need to start reflecting on how we are thinking about these histories and telling these stories, because they're much more complicated, much more difficult histories than I think we always like to think about. Thank you.
So Dr. Masur has agreed to take some questions from the audience. So if you have a question or a comment, you can approach the microphone at the center or on this end of the audience, of the hall, and present your question or comments. Please, of course, be respectful and remain civil in our discussions, and we'll see where that takes us.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
For our first couple of years in southern Maryland, we lived at Chandler's Hope Plantation along the Fort Tobacco. It was started apparently by Joe Chandler in the 1630s. I don't know how it started. It was an ancient house there, these step dwellings, and the end was large, probably late 19th century. It was said to us that house had been given by Chandler Carmelite nuns who held, held their colony there. Do you know anything about that? And are there any stories?
Not one that I expected, right? This is a topic that's intrigued me. There is a Carmelite monastery, so it's a home for Carmelite nuns that starts, I want to say, right after the American Revolution in that area, and I believe there are Carmelites who still live there. Now, I'm not sure about that specific house, but I know there is a community that lives in that area. And I've looked through some of the records. They're a very early community. They, own enslaved people, and I haven't gotten to much depth beyond that, other than some of I think the early 19th century houses are there, but they don't come until right after the American Revolution, because some of the Jesuits are instrumental in trying to get them installed and make sure that they have people to work the land so that they have money, right?
Thank you. Pete Himmelhaber from the Historical Society. Researching land records, and I find that many families here left their land to the Catholic Church so they could get it away into heaven somehow, and that sounds like an easy way to do it. I'm sure not enough study has been done to this as to what happened to all the enslaved, indentured animals, everything else on that plantation when the Jesuits got it, or the other priests too. So I know up here, we have a place up here called Wildwood. That belonged to the Jesuits for a long time. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. When I started going through these histories and trying to make sense of all of the property records, I eventually just gave up, because I was like, there are historians who have done this in much better detail than I could ever do. And at my core, I'm an archaeologist, and I was like, if I do this, I'm never going to finish my dissertation. I'm never going to be able to move on to anything else. But yeah, it's dizzying, the amount of land that people leave to them. And I don't see a ton of records of enslaved individuals being left, with the exception of White Marsh in Prince George's County, which I'm trying to remember which carol leaves it to them. Does somebody know?
I'm sorry, that was Prince George's, by Baltimore, north side of Baltimore.
Yeah, there's another property up there. But yeah, oftentimes someone would leave them, or they'd sort of like negotiate, oh, well, you can keep living on the land, but deed it off to us before you pass away. You keep living there until you pass away, and then it's ours. And there's, I think, the Deer Creek, is that the one that you were thinking about? Maybe there's one that's up north of Baltimore, and that's sort of the history of that property, and they don't hold it onto it for a long period of time. But when we're looking at these histories, it's really difficult to track people associated with them, because the deeds don't convey people, at least the deeds that are preserved in public property records a lot of the time. But I would love, it's probably in a lot of family papers and family histories, because the only archival records that I work with, records I work with regularly are at Georgetown. But that's definitely, it's a great avenue for more research to try and make sense of that. That's a great question. I mean, I would say that, they do it together. It's probably, from the versions of the story that I have heard, the community are the ones who provide the land. The community are the ones who sort of start the congregation, but it's the Jesuit who sort of makes the decision that we need to segregate the parish. I think this is 1904, 1905 that separation happens. I think the Christmas Mass ends, and the priest, decides that we're not going to have Mass here for a little while and let everyone cool off, because I guess it came to blows, the conflict that happened. And my understanding is he makes this decision that we're going to separate out. But it's the community who sort of makes it happen with the land and the building. Oh, please. I'm sure you know the history better than I do.
I work at the archive at St.
Yes.
So what the story said, it was a three-way bridge. Some of the congregation, black African Americans, stayed, and one of those people lived to be 104 years old, and she was actually buried at St. Michael's because she did not want to be priest. She loved it. Her whole life was a priest, so she did not want to leave St. Michael's. But St. Michael's, being St. Michael's and segregation, we went over to St. Peter's in Hall, so we didn't have a church. But the priest came and said Mass one month, and then he went back to St. Michael's, and that's how we had Mass. But the Mass was in a hall that looked like a wooden society, and that was not a church. So they petitioned and kept petitioning him while trying to go up to the archdiocese and have a church built. And so it was the people who wanted their own church, a place of worship, they called it. And so when they built the first St. Peter's, there was a big wooden structure with stained glass, held 350 people. That's on how they got the first St. Peter's Clay in 1905. It came on the Jesuit roll, officially on the roll as St. Peter Clay. But we were technically until 1977, belonging to St. Michael.
Okay.
So it really was a split like that. So that's how we became a predominantly African American church.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I'm getting an education here. I need to come visit you guys. I know you've been developing museum exhibits, and I've been talking with a couple members of the community, trying to see what we can do to provide artifacts for those exhibits. But yeah, please, we should chat more, because I was talking with some of the members of the community, and they're like, I hear all these different versions of this history. So thank you.
Hi, Mary Brennan. I've been doing a lot of research recently on Father Andrew White and the initial mission over to the New World. I'm doing some writing on it. So when the first mission began with Father Andrew and the brother and the other priest who came over on the Ark and Dove, at that point, it was anticipated that the second Lord Baltimore would be funding their mission work. And in fact, that was what was written in, the declaration, for Maryland and so forth, mission first, and then the economic part of it, for Lord Baltimore was supposed to be secondary. However, the Jesuits were not given any support from Lord Baltimore for various reasons. No judgment here, just that was circumstance. But they came over, their primary mission was to convert the natives, as Jesuits did in India beforehand and other parts of the world beforehand. That was their mission. And they had to sustain themselves, and so they had to create the plantation at St. Inigos. And they brought over several of their own people from England. They also went to Virginia and bought the indentures of both Catholic and Protestant workers there who didn't want to stay in Virginia, and so forth. And that's how they did the initial stocking. But the mission came first, and the settlements came secondly. And for example, the missions more northbound, even up toward New York, those missions were run out of actually St. Thomas Manor initially, before they became plantations up there. So it was, the primary mission was conversion, and the secondary mission was to feed people, because as they said, people don't listen to the message of God on an empty stomach. And so that was a critical part of the equation. And I can't speak to after the era I was studying, but that was the scenario at the time. One other quick thing I wanted to tell you about, I had a chance to talk to the archivist who'd been at St. Mary's Piscataway for several years. He's now at Franciscan University. but he still has his archives from Piscataway. And he said something I'll be looking into, and that is that the Piscataway Indians, who were converted under Father Andrew and his helpers, ended up during the 1648, the Great Revolution and the extermination of Catholicism overtly in Maryland, they continued to remain Catholics. The Indians carried forth the faith in Maryland. And when the Piscataways, left to go join the Canoys, apparently a good number of them actually remained in Maryland, and they stayed below the radar, and they still have that community very heavily around St. Mary's, Piscataway, and the Accokeek area. Very strong Catholics. They're the ones who sustained the faith and kept it going when the priests were gone. And I found that just amazing. So,
thank you. Yeah, it's a really interesting history, and it's something that's really confounding to try and find all of the documents for these histories, because oftentimes someone has found some of the sacramental records and pulled them together, but it's never published. So I can't find it. I have to make those inroads and talk to the people who have done this research. So thank you. We should talk more.
I want to thank you personally for designing this for me. I'm Derek Rivera. I'm brand new to St. Mary's College from Louisiana. I have a very dear friend who's descendant of the Georgetown slaves in Baton Rouge. And so we were talking earlier about being sold down to Louisiana. I am a Catholic, an African-American Catholic. And I get that question often, why are you Catholic? And my mom's Catholic, her mom was Catholic, her daddy was Catholic, his daddy was Catholic. I go back 4 or 5 generations. And so this talk is really bringing home for me the history of my family's religious legacy and why we are still Catholic to this day. The other piece, and Claudette was, and I've been in St. Mary's County 3 weeks, I think. My home church in New Orleans is St. Peter's Labor Catholic Church. My home church here is St. Peter's Labor Catholic Church. And I'm learning all of this rich history, and I feel like you guys just did this all for me. So thank you.
Well, thank you. Yes, we should talk more. Yeah. One of the things especially, I'm at the Catholic University of America, and one of the things that, we have a whole sort of school of church history, or as a sort of part of the School of Theology and Religious Studies, and one of the historians there is a historian of slavery, and so I've been talking to her about, you get these crazy ideas in the summer when you're not teaching your students, like, we should bring this up, we should try and talk about, Black Catholics are not just this small segment and things that happen in the the 20th century. This is a really deep history, and it's something that more people should know about, and especially one that goes back very, very far in southern Maryland.
I'm back again. I was very interested when the sheriffs were go to take an inventory of all the Catholic churches that were here, And of course, Mr. Beitzel wrote about the Catholic churches, but he missed one, okay? And it was a church at Nuns Oak. And now, Nuns Oak is down in Medley's Neck, okay, for you people in St. Mary's. And the priest there was never called a priest. He was called Mr. And I see the record where he ordered nails, hammers, and stuff like that. I'll see the record where he was awarded an acre of land on Nuns Oak. And what's he going to do on an acre of land? He can't even raise potatoes on an acre of land. He's building a church there, okay? And of course, this was right during the takeover. And it's the 1650s, 55 or so. And so it's very interesting, and I actually found a document, the family said that it was where the chapel stood, 200 yards from Nuns Oak. That house is still there.
That's really interesting, and this is where archaeology comes in when you want to say like, oh, are we going to go find it? we can talk to Dr. Parno and see if he's excited about this too.
Well, on behalf of the St. Mary's County Historical Society and the Center for the Study of Democracy, I'd like to thank you all for coming out tonight. The weather looks like it's clearing up. We had a great talk, and we look forward to hosting you for many more future programs. So thank you, and thank you to Dr. Masur.